Hello, fam. This is Dr. Ade. Welcome to my channel again. This is an Afrocentric channel that's designed to present information, knowledge, and issues from an African perspective. I do this channel thinking about the words of Imhotep. 5,000 years ago, he said, "Student, first know thyself. Then knowledge of God and the universe will be available to you." Well, this is part 3 of the tutorial to unwash African brains. Part 3 demonstrates racist American cultural values because these are behavioral motivators in American social unrest. Part 3 further shows why anti-racist legislation for social, political, and economic change somehow always reverts back to the racist norm, thus preventing substantive African American progress. I have to share with you how much I agonized over this segment. I must have edited this video 5 times before I was satisfied. The problem was that I wanted to soften my language a little bit. I wanted to dull the sharp edges of my message and speak truth to power at the same time. Well, that's very difficult to do. And it's my natural style to move in, to seize the ground, and to take no captives. But each time I was sure I had this video completed, I would then become dissatisfied. In the final hour, I decided that this is no time to entertain folks. Not when African Americans are being murdered in cold blood by police violence as never before. I'm talking about men, women, and children. No one is being spared. There is no respect of persons from these violent policemen. So, family, this is no time to water down the message. This is the time when the healing power and the righteousness of my words has to be effective. I have to speak truth to power because that is what God has sent me to do. In part 1 of this tutorial, we've provided the cultural information needed to grasp the deep cultural implications contained in part 2. And in part 2, it is revealed how the attitudes, beliefs, values, worldview, and especially the 5 dominant features of Caucasian culture are hostile to the African psyche, well-being, and survival. So now we are at part 3, demonstrating the racist cultural values of Caucasians as motivators in American social unrest. It further shows here in part 3. It shows why anti-racist socio-political changes always seem to revert back to the racist norm, thus preventing substantive African American progress. Now, we've been discussing racist beliefs and values that are norms within Caucasian culture. And these racist norms are baked into the cake of the Caucasian culture, institutions, psyche, and behavior. As a cultural norm, beliefs in and value of racism is so deeply embedded in the Caucasian psyche that most individuals act them out unconsciously. Let me speak truth to power. The core of the race problem in America is that Caucasian Americans are not going to change. No amount of praying, no amount of negotiating, meeting, uprising, and carrying placards is going to change them permanently. In part 3, the approach that I use is first to present an analysis of the ongoing cycle of American socio-political change and relapse. 2, to relate the American cycle of socio-political change and relapse, to relate it to the African American battered group disorder. This is a theory that I just came up with, so I am coining this theory in this particular video. 3, we suggest that African Americans should expand their strategies for demonstration and protests. 4, we suggest that African Americans should strengthen ties with Mother Africa. And 5, we encourage community-wide dialogue on the critical issue of African assimilation into Caucasian culture, Caucasian features, and Caucasian cultural values. Let's look at the analysis of racist American cycle of social, political, and economic change that is always followed by relapse. I believe this is the root cause of what I am calling the American battered group disorder. Let's look at this cycle of American socio-political change that is always followed by relapse. The illustration represents the racist, violent American cultural matrix. Every Caucasian American is part and parcel of this system at some level of engagement. Participation in the system includes silence, because silence itself in the face of evil is complicity. The illustration also shows how Africans are on a gerbil wheel, spinning on a wheel that goes nowhere. After African Americans have done all the protesting, have done all the marching and all the suffering, some level of legislative change is made. However, the change lasts for only a little while. And that's because America is a sick society that takes pleasure in inflicting pain and suffering upon African Americans. Now, during the period of change, every so-called minority group in America, especially Caucasian women, will benefit more from the changes than the African Americans who suffered to earn them. A relapse always follows, a reversal back to the racist norm. African Americans always expect this relapse. We are well aware of Caucasian political and personal behavior. African Americans know for sure that racism is baked into the cake of the Caucasian psyche and culture. So getting permanent anti-racist change from them is like trying to remove the milk, the egg, or the sugar from a donut. The basis of American culture is race hatred and violence. That's America's stock in trade. And the rest of the world knows it. Let's go on to look at the beliefs and values that are embedded within racist Caucasian American culture. On the left, we see beliefs, and on the right, the values. And these are defining, motivating elements of Caucasian behavior. Now, for those African folks who want to become more like Caucasians, here is a lesson on how to become an enslaved monster. What are the beliefs and claims? Well, number one, white supremacy. Number two, male superiority. Number three, imperialism, the right to be the world's only imperialist nation. Number four, hegemony, the right to force Caucasian culture and religion on other people who don't want it. They have their own. Number five, the belief that violence represents strength and proves superiority. Let's go to values, because it is beliefs and values, but especially values, that drive human behavior. Number one, in Caucasian culture, money and wealth are valued over humanity and life. What is it on the dollar bill? In God we trust. Money is their God. Number two, protect and maintain the value of whiteness. Number three, they find value in suppressing African American progress. And number four, they find value in spreading the false claim I repeat, the false claim of being the ultimate model of democracy and justice in the world. These are the most highly valued elements of Caucasian culture. These beliefs and values define them and motivate their conscious and unconscious behavior. Now, this cannot be a lie against them. These are facts. It summarizes their entire history on the planet. The strongest proof has always been demonstrated in the Caucasian use of the Christian religion worldwide. They use Christianity to promote and maintain these very beliefs and values all over the world. They slaughter millions of people in the name of their God and country. They use the Christian Bible to brainwash Africans to be against themselves in self-hatred. A false teaching of the Bible has been weaponized so that Africans will slavishly assimilate Caucasian beliefs and values and become mirror images of Caucasian monstrosity. Caucasian culture is so abnormal that I've tried to make sense out of it by comparing it to an addiction. And I've defined addiction. I took the definition from the dictionary. Addiction is a compulsive, chronic, physiological or psychological need for a habit-forming substance, behavior, or activity having harmful physical, psychological, or social effects. Well, it sounds like Caucasian racism to me. Another definition is a strong inclination to do, to use, or to indulge in something. It still sounds like Caucasian racist culture and psyche to me. So I'm asking two questions. Is racism really similar to an addiction? I would say yes. If that is true, is that why they seem incapable of permanent humanism? What is humanism? Humanism is having a strong interest in or concern for human welfare, human values, and human dignity. This is not a joke, folks. These are serious questions put forward at a time when Africans are being murdered for pleasure in cold blood. Caucasians are murdering African men, women, and children for pleasure, right out in the open. For long we have wondered why Caucasians are the only group of people on the planet that absolutely hates the rest of the human family for no apparent reason. like an addiction. Caucasians seem to crave violence. They seem unable to control their violent, hateful nature. And the obvious pleasure they get from murdering and maiming and bloodletting is simply not a normal human trait. Let me say that again. The obvious pleasure that they get from all this murdering, maiming, and bloodletting is not a normal human trait. Such reckless hatred, such animalistic violence is just not human. Normal human beings do not get pleasure from cold-blooded murder with no remorse. People cannot call themselves superior human beings when their 24/7 normal behavior is not even representative of most warm-blooded animals like dogs and cats. They can't claim superiority. Not when their behavior more resembles that of the emotionless, inhuman, cold-blooded lizards. And at the same time, they call themselves Christians. How is this what Jesus taught? And my God, how can Africans be so blind and unthinking as to follow them? These are not words of hate. These are facts and statements of truth. The proof is in centuries-long behavior. People around the world know it to be true. Especially, everyone, especially Caucasians, need to read two books. One is entitled The ISIS Papers, The Keys to the Colors. It is authored by noted psychiatrist Dr. Francis Cress-Welsing. Another must-read book is entitled The Iceman Inheritance, Prehistoric Sources of Western Man's Racism, Sexism, and Aggression, authored by Michael Bradley and Dr. John Henry Clark. At this time, here is a message and a warning for brainwashed, assimilated Africans who love Caucasians more than they love themselves, more than they love their fellow Africans. The message is found in an African proverb that says, "The stubborn fly that follows the dead body to the grave will be buried with the dead body." Let's go on to look at the effects of Caucasian American racial abuse. Caucasian American racial abuse and violence causes what I call the African American battered group disorder. The way I came up with it was by thinking about and comparing it to the battered wife syndrome. That whole cycle of behavior just continues on. It just cycles around and goes back to the starting point. The difference here, though, is that there is no honeymoon period, as in the battered wife syndrome. Not for African Americans. African Americans only know the ongoing perpetual 400-year nightmare right up to 2020. Every institution in America is invested in the 5 dominant features of Caucasian culture: racism, sexism, imperialism, hegemony, and violence. This is what we call systemic racism and discrimination. So we have society-wide behavioral norms in America that are grounded in the values of money, whiteness, violence, greed, and imperialism. Now, my area of expertise is not psychology, but it only takes a layman's common sense and basic freshman academic training to come up with this assessment. That's all it takes to correctly analyze abnormal, violent, inhumane, toxic behavior that has been experienced by African people in America, upfront and personal, all over the world for hundreds of years. Our ancestors who suffered on those filthy plantations, they knew this without the fancy words. It didn't take genius for them to figure it out. Common sense is all it takes to be able to compare the Caucasian socio-political system behavior with the battered wife syndrome. For too long, family, for too long we have tried not to hurt Caucasians' feelings. But it's crunch time now. This lecture, this tutorial, gives me no pleasure because I much prefer teaching uplifting topics to my people. Let's go on to look at this, what I am calling the African American battered group disorder. What do we have? We have racist American social, cultural, political, and economic norms. It's the normal state of things. The normal American situation is this. We have the racist Caucasian American social, political, and economic baseline norm. Baseline norm, let me say it again, that maintains ongoing terrorism, extreme physical brutality, torture, racial discrimination, as well as severe emotional abuse of African Americans. What else do we have? We have African Americans who for centuries have suffered post-traumatic stress disorder from the racist experiences of codified enslavement, post-enslavement Jim Crow laws, Ku Klux Klan terrorism, White Citizens Council legislation, deputized slave catchers, police brutality, legalized and de facto apartheid, and community redlining. I could go on, but time does not permit. And I'm going to present just one historical example in this tutorial because of time constraints. The norm for Caucasian culture is abnormality. By human life-sustaining standards, Caucasian culture is abnormal. Let's call it what it is. Abnormality is the Caucasian American baseline norm. So now we look at African American battered group disorder. I just talked about phase 1. This is phase 2. Phase 2, whereby African American tension built up in the 1950s. African Americans had continuous unmet needs and unresolved issues. African Americans suffered fear, anxiety, insecurity, and depression until they reached a boiling point. At that time, African American Christian integrationists sought Caucasian Americans' love and acceptance in a civil rights struggle, and they began to petition the American government as a solution. At the same time, we had the Black nationalists and Pan-Africanists. All Black nationalists and some, if not most, Pan-Africanists sought separation from Caucasian Americans in a struggle for human rights. And they began to prepare a petition before the United Nations as a solution. Ever since the days of enslavement, there have been two different and distinct sentiments among African folks. There were the house slaves, who were mixed with the slave master's blood. They always had better clothing, better food, and better treatment. In response, they loved the slave master. House slaves always wanted to be around the Caucasians. And these sentiments were somewhat reflected among the 1950s integrationists. The integrationist theme expresses the hope that the quality of Americans or Africans' character would be able to change the hearts and minds of Caucasian races. Now, the field slaves Their situation was much different. They were worked from can't see in the morning until can't see at night. They were always exhausted, hungry, and clothed in dirty rags. The sentiments of the field slaves was more or less represented by Black nationalists in the 1950s civil rights struggle. All Black nationalists were separationists. They had no faith in Caucasians ever changing their racist hearts, minds, and behaviors. No. Instead, nationalists expressed the belief that the only way African people in this country could have peace was to build separate communities. Communities separate and apart from all Caucasians. Pan-Africanists were more or less the cultural unit within Black nationalism. They advocated a Back to Africa movement, and their theme was Africa for Africans. Martin Luther King, the Reverend Martin Luther King, led the integrationist faction of the civil rights movement, with Jesse Jackson by his side. Integrationists focused their concerns on citizenship issues and civil rights. Therefore, they petitioned the U.S. government. Now, there were several prominent leaders of the Black nationalist factions of the civil rights movement, namely Bobby Seale, Huey Newton, Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, Stokely Carmichael, who started out as an integrationist, but then jumped the fence and became a Black nationalist. All Black nationalists held a special allegiance to the Pan-Africanist leader Marcus Garvey. Garvey led an enormous Black empowerment and Back to Africa movement in the 1920s. Nationalists had a global perspective which focused on human rights. Therefore, they took their petition to the world body of the United Nations. So you can tell from this that African Americans have never been a monolithic group in America. And it needs to be said that the 1950s and the 1960s struggle was for a better life. We go on to phase 3. Phase 3 occurs when the racist American government is forced to change the norm. So legislative conciliations are made. They need to calm African people down. Business is suffering. They needed to restore relative peace and social stability. And then we move quickly into phase 4. Phase 4 shows the relapse in the 1980s that has lasted right up until 2020. What happened? We have government reversal back to racist legislation, and that is accompanied by racist political, institutional, and economic norms. Social relapse followed. Back to racist social norms in overt racist de facto apartheid behavior. Back to racial injustice, and back to extreme violence against African Americans. This was not the first cycle. I only used this one for convenience. If you go back in America's history, you will see that time after time after time, changes were made. Progressive changes. Changes that eased the lives of African people. But then, within a short period of time, things went right back to the racist norm. The racist, abnormal norm is the Caucasian baseline. But it is abnormal for human beings to act that way. But it shows us, it convinces us that in America nothing ever changes. And I say to African Americans that it is time to break the cycle. Here again, I am showing this illustration. And it's an illustration of systemic racism that is baked into the cake of American culture. The medical definition of insanity is this: doing the same thing over and over and over and over again while expecting different results. African people, stop the 200 years of madness. We should have learned something in 200 years about these people who are unrelenting and unrepentant in their wickedness and hatred. They are never going to change. And nothing in America is going to change. It is time for Africans to change ourselves in order to break this cycle of foolishness and futility. I'm looking at the desperation of Caucasians currently. I'm thinking hard about the desperation that they are demonstrating, and the world sees it. I am not only thinking hard about it, I am praying about it. I am asking philosophical and spiritual questions concerning this situation. There are issues that need to be addressed that no one is discussing at this extraordinary time in human history. spiritual questions, such as, does God and the universe view racist, violent, hateful, unrepentant Caucasians as being unredeemable? Watch out, Christians. Are they unredeemable? Their centuries-old behavior, consistent behavior, inform that they are not redeemable. My second question is this: if this is so, if they are unredeemable, is that why Caucasians are now genetically programmed to become extinct? Some of you didn't know that. I can see eyebrows lifting. Right now, Caucasians have an irreversible 0.7% worldwide birth rate. Does that inform you of some of the issues that they are preoccupied with? It should. Another spiritual question. Have Caucasians considered the possibility that their violent, hateful, murderous behavior could somehow be linked to their genetic extinction? Now there is something to think about. Wow. And my final question is a very serious one for Caucasians. Is the Caucasian current increase in inhuman behavior the reason that their extinction rate is speeding up? Serious questions. We are living, family, at a very unusual time in human history. This present generation is witnessing in real time the extinction of a race of people before our very eyes. The knowledge that they are dying out worldwide and cannot be reversed is eating them from inside out. This is what is right now driving Caucasians out of their minds. After all the killing and stealing, out of all the evil, they are becoming extinct, and they will have to leave everything to the people whom they have to the people that they have been killing in wholesale numbers all this time. It is all being left to the people of color in this world. Now, I'm sorry if some people's feelings are hurt by this presentation, but I'm not trying to be intentionally offensive to Caucasians. However, I do not value Caucasians' bruised egos over the lives of my fellow Africans. And I am not going to waste my time producing some cotton-mouthed video that doesn't present the naked truth that liberates Africans and is capable of liberating some Caucasians as well. My words here are not new. African people have been correctly analyzing Caucasians since the plantation days. It's only that folks have been too polite to just say it publicly right out loud. But if you can kill African people in wholesale numbers for no reason, just kill them. And do it with pleasure. Then why should anyone be considering Caucasians' feelings, considering their bruised egos? This is a wake-up call. We have known for hundreds of years that Caucasians have dark souls. It will take concerted effort for at least 3 generations to rid their psyches and their culture of racism. They've even said it recently during the Democratic National Convention. The irony of this is that since they have not repented to Almighty God, it may be too little too late. Since they have not agreed to pay African Americans the reparations that they are due, it may be too little too late. And again, let me caution assimilated Africans with a guaranteed plight. That's plight with a P for Paul. The guaranteed plight of the stubborn fly. Just continue to stick with them. Just continue to eat off of them. And you will be buried with them, either literally or figuratively. African Americans need to stop trying to change folks who are incapable of change. It's past time to start changing ourselves. We need to stop limiting ourselves by just moving stuff around inside this Caucasian American box. And don't even think outside the box either. Because outside the box, you're still connected to the box. You're still referring to the box. Instead, we need to throw the damn box away for good. We need to start doing things that are new and fresh and independent of Caucasians. We can do it. And here are some suggested strategies for permanent change that African Americans can use to opt out of the ages-old cycle of racist Caucasian American abuse. Now, I realize that change, substantive change, is never easy. However, positive permanent change has to come by first changing ourselves. Here are some suggested ways that we can opt out of this vicious cycle. We can invest money in Africa. We can sue the United States for reparations. We can open African American banks. We can obtain dual citizenship in Africa. We can start selective economic boycotts. We can begin home-based vending businesses. We can establish family and community businesses. We can begin informal community bartering practices where no money is needed. We can establish one-stop community shopping centers, starting such centers community by community, one small shop at a time. We can start, and we need desperately to start, Afrocentric private schools with African teachers. And finally, we can charge America. We can take America to court and charge them with crimes against humanity at the United Nations. And this suggestion is only at the bottom of this kind of pyramid because it's the longest line. We need to charge them with crimes against humanity immediately. What are we waiting for? Are we waiting for them to take up our cause? Lord have mercy. Family, we are at a critical junction in human history. This is a time when the rich folks who act like monsters have enough power and control to dehumanize the rest of the world, and they are trying. Many people claim to be religious. They claim to be spiritual, but behavior reveals what they really are. I personally draw my understandings about God, the universe, and life from my African worldview and belief system. That is how I have become one of the elders who can sit on the ground and see more than others who are perched at the top of the trees. Be not deceived, my people. Almighty God is not mocked. There is a living God, the God which created Africans as Homo sapiens sapiens. What does that mean? It means that God created the only modern human beings on this earth. That God created the only doubly wise modern human beings on earth. That's what science calls us. And we don't even know about it. God created the only parents of all humanity out of that first stock of African human beings. That creator God is the living God, which African people have worshipped for 1,000 years before Caucasians even existed on the planet. And that living God shall prevail. I say to the one almighty creator God, to God be the glory. Ashe, ashe, ashe.